These are the Francis Leekya Fetishes that are left in the Sedonawolf collection. Francis and I started our collaboration around 1997 or 98 until he passed away about 5 or 6 years later. We tried to create a work that people would remember him by, and in my opinion these are some of the best traditional fetishes, Leekya fetishes, that he ever made, and frankly some of the best to come out of Zuni. Before Francis and I met, his fetishes were small like this. You can still see that it's a Francis. The squared off muzzle, the sense of movement, the beautiful offerings, in this case natural turquoise and coral, but there really wasn't an opportunity for Francis to express himself completely. They were so small, it was difficult, especially Francis. By then he had several strokes. He was wheelchair bound. He carved with one hand, and carving this small with only one hand, carving with one hand is difficult to begin with, but this small is extremely difficult. I thought giving Francis a bigger palette, a bigger canvas, would offer him the opportunity to truly express himself. And that's what we did. We moved from this size to larger, where Francis could hold the fetish in one hand and touch it against the rotating wheel. And what you'll notice on Francis carvings are hundreds of little flat spots. I don't know if you can see it, but there's flat spots all through this. And that's exactly where Francis touched the wheel. So later Francis carvings, when he was paralyzed on one side of his body, had all these flat spots. That's a good way to recognize a later carving from an earlier. Frankly, Francis's place in history, I think, is assured. If it were not for Francis, there wouldn't be a Hayes, there wouldn't be a Delvin, there wouldn't be a Freddie, and there wouldn't be a Bryson Babalu, Francis's grandson. Francis gained his inspiration from his father Leekya. This is a Leekya carving. It was made long before there was electricity in Zuni. Everything about it is handmade. It was given to Francis by his father when Francis was about 8 or 9 years old, and it stayed in the Leekya family till just before his death, when he gave it to me. Because there was no electricity, carvers took a lot more time with these files. Electricity tended to move the process a bit faster. But before we get into the entire collection and the details of it, I'd like to show you the differences between the Leekya family as it exists now. Francis loved to put movement in his carvings, and his faces were very expressive. Oftentimes he would put in his carving almost a self-portrait. His face was paralyzed on one side and a bit distorted, and sometimes you'll see that in his carvings where one side of the face is a little bit lower than the other. You'll always see movement. He tried to put one foot ahead of the other. He tried to give the feet, the toes, claws, simply by putting toes in there. The offerings varied during the course of our association. He used turquoise, natural turquoise I might add, and he carved that natural turquoise a lot like a Leekya leaf. So you'll sometimes see a Leekya leaf in turquoise. You'll often see the coral branch, which is beautiful oxblood coral, natural, carved like an animal itself. Sometimes he'll put a face. This seems to have a face right here. Here's an eye, here's the mouth. Maybe I have too vivid imagination, but I see that. So oftentimes the offerings in themselves were work of art. Again, you see movement at the rear end. Here's the bear walking. This was Francis. He took great pride in his work. Each piece was an original. He didn't copy. He used the stone as a guide. He truly tried to release the spirit of the bear that he saw from the stone that was holding it. And from that, you'll see that same idea in Hayes's work. This is a Hayes Leekya bear. Hayes's faces are not as square as Francis's, but he does have movement. He did put toes in the bear's feet. Again, the hind quarter is much like Francis's, but the tails are a bit different. Francis would swing the tail up. Hayes would make it more rounded. The offerings are extremely important. Carvers, oftentimes you can identify a carver by the offering and by the arrowhead. If you notice, Hayes's offerings are completely different from a Francis offering. The nostrils of the nose are higher, whereas on Francis's pieces the nostrils were in the squared off face. The mouth is cut straight across. Sometimes Francis would do that, sometimes he would give it this V shape. Delvin, Francis's son also, had again a different offering and a different arrowhead than his father, although Delvin tended to carve his fetishes with more of a squared off face. The ears were a bit different. The feet, though, were different. He didn't give his fetishes quite as much movement. If you notice on a Delvin piece, the feet come straight, almost straight back to the middle of the bear, whereas Francis tended to keep the feet more, each foot would be more precisely carved. Delvin tended to bring these feet further back. Freddie, Francis's son, also carved much like his father with the squared off face. The nostrils in the squared off face, but the faces were different. He kept the offerings similar, but the arrowheads were different. He gave the bears more of a shoulder here. Francis tended to keep his bears more rounded. The hind quarters are different on a Freddie than on a Francis. However, Freddie Leekya signed his fetishes, when he signed them, FL. Francis occasionally signed his pieces also FL, for Francis Leekya and Freddie Leekya FL. So that can be confusing. The best bet when you're trying to identify these is with the arrowhead and the general look of the carving. You can see a Freddie really looks quite a bit different from a Francis. Notice on a Freddie how the shoulder blades are separated here, where a Francis, the whole general shape is more rounded, much like his father's work. If you notice, his father also had the incising in each foot. However, Leekya Deyusi's carvings were very rounded. Traditionally, this piece was a ceremonial piece. It was a hunting piece. The family would take it on hunting trips. So the offering has been changed many times. But on a commercial Leekya Deyusi piece, you'll often see the arrowhead mounted backwards with a more colorful offering on it. This arrowhead was found on the reservation after a lightning storm, which makes it particularly important to Zuni people. And since it was a genuine hunting fetish, they tied it to the bear. The last of the current Francis family carvers is Bryson Babalu. Bryson is Francis's grandson, and his fetishes really are, to some extent, a mix between Leekya, the old man, and Francis. Bryson tends to give his fetishes more of a rounded feeling, very expressive, like Francis. He gives it more color, though. Often you'll see a coral tongue, you'll see a he/she, a completely different offering. Bryson loved Francis, and of course is a Leekya, but he tends to try to give his fetishes expression like Francis did.